Why is it that some people get better at games or things than other people do, even though they spent the same amount of time on them? Why is it that two people can spend the same amount of time on something and one is way better or has way more results than the other person? And I think I found the answer in the form of what I'm going to call the skill acquisition principle, which is basically that skill doesn't increase depending on how much time you spend, but rather how fast you can detect and correct errors. That's it. Basically, it's not how much time you play, it's just how quick do you notice a mistake and then correct it. That's all it is. You can click off the video now if you want. The rest of this is basically just going to be me explaining how I came to this answer and like how this stands as a principle for learning. To come to this answer, we're going to do something called a thought experiment, which is kind of like a scientific experiment, except we just do it mentally because we don't, just because, right? Just because, okay? And it makes sense, I promise. The thing we're focusing on is a difference in improvement, in skill, in the same amount of time. So we don't change time. I want you to imagine two people who are identical in every single way. They have the same intelligence, the same genetics, the same home life, they read the same books, watch the same Alfie videos, they do everything the same. We just change how quick they notice mistakes, so they detect errors, and how fast they correct them and they adapt and they improve. That's all we're changing. And just one thing, with time, even though the time is the same for person A and person B, the way they can spend their time is different. So person A can spend his time doing the thing differently to how person B does it. I want to make that clear because that's a really important part of this thought experiment. At first, when you're thinking about skill, you want to blame it on luck or genetics or what material they have access to and stuff like that, and what control freaks they use. If you play video games, you know what I'm talking about. Like, or like, do you use paddles? Do you play claw? It's a bunch of factors that you want to list off. But really, this is for video games, but maybe it's like in the gym, it'd be a protein powder. You get the idea. Really, what these variables come down to is three things. Signal quality, which is basically what information is the person receiving. Then feedback speed, so basically how fast do you notice errors? How fast can you see that you've made an error? And then third is just error correction behavior. So do you actually correct your mistake or do you just continue to make the mistake? That's basically the three things it comes down to. The thing we're really going to focus on is noticing error correction, but I do want you to remember the information you receive and how fast you can receive that information. So we're focusing on the error detection behavior between these two people, and we also know that they can allocate their time differently. So one guy could spend more time reading, another could spend less time reading, but they have the same total time with the task. So say for example it was business. No, let's say it was chopping down a tree. You've heard the famous quote, if you gave me 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend the first 4 sharpening my axe. That's basically what's going on here. One guy, they spend the same total time of 6 hours chopping down a tree. It's just that one of them chops the tree down, spends their time differently, if that makes sense. Same principle here. Rate of progress is just determined by how quick you can get that feedback and adapt to it. The process of improvement is basically act, assess, adjust. That's it. That's from Unscripted, a book by MJ DeMarco, really good read. You do an action, you observe what happens, and if you don't like what happened, you adjust your next action so that, and the cycle repeats. That's it. Here's an interesting thing. Just doing the work is not enough to improve. I'm going to tell you a story. I used to play a lot of Rocket League. A lot. Like 7 hours a day on average, from what I remember. And I had a friend who was only allowed to play on weekends. With this information alone, who do you think was better at the game? Logically, you would say me because I spent more time, but now that we've been thinking about time doesn't necessarily mean better skill, you might start to realize that my friend who only played on weekends was better than me, despite me playing 7 hours per day on average. You want to know why? It's because in those 7 hours, I didn't correct mistakes. I didn't focus on what I needed to focus on, which was like shooting and actually learning how to defend. Instead, I was learning how to flip reset when I was in like platinum. It doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? If you've ever played video games and you're hard stuck in a rank, I guarantee it's not guarantee. I'm gonna hypothesize it's probably the fact that you're focusing on the wrong thing. You don't need to, like, if you're playing Fortnite, you don't need to learn how to edit any faster. You're good enough for that. You can't aim a gun. How on earth are you going to improve if you keep on focusing on the thing you're good at rather than the mistakes you blatantly make? This is why someone can literally play for 10,000 hours. You've heard that quote that it takes around 10,000 hours to master a skill. Not necessarily. There are people who spend thousands of hours training, playing a game, or doing, like, focusing on a skill, and they're still horrible at it because they didn't correct mistakes and they weren't continuously improving over time. They didn't notice what they had to assess and adjust. Because if you don't take the time to actually look at your errors, objectively assess them, and correct them, you are basically just reinforcing bad habits. If you don't pay attention to the mistakes you're making, you're not going to correct them. And so you're just going to keep on repeating the same mistake over and over until you finally acknowledge it and then correct it. When you hear the word practice, a lot of people, they don't actually explain what makes good practice. Because people say all these nice sounding phrases, practice makes perfect. But a lot of people don't actually know what real practice looks like. Because it's not just hop into, like if it's Rocket League, it's not just hop into free play and hit the ball in a direction. It's focusing on an area where you constantly make mistakes and correcting them. That's what's known today as deliberate practice. When you're starting off, you literally just doing anything will make improvements, because the likelihood is you're going to naturally make mistakes and correct them quickly, just like naturally. But when you start to plateau, when you stop improving as fast, you need to notice your mistakes and correct them. I'm going to keep on saying this. Notice your mistakes and correct them. That's all it takes to improve skill. Forget how much time you spend. It's not important how much time you spend on a task. It's how quick do you notice mistakes and how quickly do you correct them? And are you correcting the right mistakes? Because sometimes you may be in a situation where you look at something, you made a mistake and you correct it, but it wasn't actually the mistake it wasn't that thing that caused it, if that makes sense. I can't think of an example. Say if the lesson is, imagine the gym. Say the lesson you needed to take was that your form was bad and so you injured yourself. And instead of actually just correcting your form, you just lowered the amount of reps you do. That would be a right situation, but you took the wrong mistake from it. So that's why I said feedback clarity. You need to know what the actual problem is. So if we wanted someone to stay low level forever, what would we do? I would remove the information. I would eliminate them from consuming information. So I would not allow them to actually research what they could improve. I wouldn't allow it. Secondly, I would remove them actually acknowledging their mistakes. Because if they can't see what they're doing wrong, they're not going to improve because they just don't realize that they're doing something wrong in the first place. And if they don't have information to realize they can do things better, they're going to stay the same. And also, just to make sure that they stay low level forever, I would make sure that they can't correct their mistakes. That's how you keep someone low level forever. So if you wanted to make someone high level, you give them all the information they need, all the speed, and the feedback speed and the clarity being amazing, and also give them an easy time to correct their mistakes. That was phrased poorly. Make it easy for them to correct their mistake. You don't get better by doing the thing more. You get better by fixing mistakes faster. Which is why skill increases in proportion to the rate at which you detect and correct errors. So when I was thinking about this, I was talking back and forth with ChatGPT, and I noticed when pro players play a new game, like if you've seen Twitch streamers who are good at games and they go onto a new game, they're weirdly better than average, like way better than average, even though obviously the game hasn't been out for enough time for them to actually learn how to play the game that well. There's no like tutorials or anything. And it's because, first off, they notice mistakes, and secondly, they take mistakes they take lessons they've learned from other games and transfer them to this one, which is why it's so important you know what mistake you need to correct, because if you correct the right mistake, you can transfer that lesson to another endeavor. Like when you learn about progressive overload in the gym, that transfers to everything. This is kind of like the principle here, just improve over time. And they compress feedback loops, meaning the cause and the time for a cause to take effect, for them to see the consequence of their actions, is much smaller, so they can get feedback quicker and improve quicker. So for example, in the gym, as we said, progressive overload, if you don't do that, you won't grow because your muscles won't get new feedback. Learning, if you don't get feedback, if you literally do not see the consequences of your actions, you won't learn anything. So the question isn't, how long have you spent doing this thing? It's, how fast do you notice and correct mistakes? The skill acquisition law. Safe.